Good evening and welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Dialogue in Development with Carolina Alves. This is one of the events marking the 70th anniversary of the Development Planning Unit, the DPU. I'm Alessio Culiulis, and the chair for this evening's dialogue, Post-Growth, Planning After Capitalism. This dialogue in development has been organized by the DPU's State and Market Research Cluster. The cluster acts as a forum for discussion, fostering the development of collaborative research ideas on the governance of development transitions. The DPU was established with a visionary mission to enhance the capacities of governments, NGOs, and communities towards achieving socially just and sustainable development. And as we celebrate this milestone, we reflect on the DPU's legacy and its contributions to international development, education, research, and practice. Tonight's discussion is a continuation of the DPU's tradition of engaging with complex challenges at urban, regional, national, and international scales. And we are very honored to have Dr. Carolina Alves, who will focus tonight on the work of British sociologist Barbara Wootton and her critique of market-driven economies. Highlighting that there might be better ways to meet the needs of a society than just with supply and demand. So this aligns very much with the DPU's commitment to fostering critical debates in development and showcasing the transformative potential of heterodox economics in envisioning post-capitalist futures. At the same time, we hope that this conversation will help us to consider how we might navigate an era of deglobalization and de-development, or new forms of nationalisms and evolving forms of capitalism, aiming for a future that can avoid the current trajectory of climate disaster. Carolina Alves is an associate professor in economics at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, UCL, and a fellow in economics at Girton College at the University of Cambridge. She specializes in macroeconomics, political economy, development, Marxeconomics, philosophy of economics, in the subfields of critical macrofinance, structuralist macroeconomics, decolonisation of economics, and heterodox economics. Carolina is currently part of the Cambridge Social Ontology Group and the Alternative Approaches to Economics Research Group. She's also the co-founder of the initiative Diversifying and Decolonising Economics and the co-founder of the UCL Center for Capitalism Studies, and the co-editor of the Development Economics blog. You must be very busy, Carolina.
Listen to you, now I know why.
Carolina also sits on the Rebuilding Macroeconomics Advisory Board, the Progressive Economy Forum Council, and the Positive Money Advisory Panel. She's the author of of two forthcoming books, Labor Value and Capitalism, a study of Karl Marx, Poverty of Philosophy, by Editora Dialética, and the co-author of the forthcoming Decolonising Economics, an introduction, which will be out with Polity Press. Final bits. So we look forward to a good exchange of ideas, and our agenda for the evening is as follows. So Carolina will speak until pretty much 6:20. After which we will move to a panel discussion. The discussion will be led by Professor Michael Walls, Professor of Development Politics and Economy, and also the director of the DPU. Michael will draw upon his extensive experience in international development planning and the private sector to engage with Carolina's intervention. Following the panel discussion, we will have a 30 minutes to a Q&A session with a commitment to concluding on time, and I'm serious about this. I'll try the impossible to finish at 7 p.m. so we can all leave. So thank you for joining us in person and online. Let's extend a warm round of applause and welcome again, Carolina.
Great, so thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. I've been now at UCL for a little bit over a year, and last week was the first time I gave a talk at the School of Islamic and East European Studies, and now here, and I keep come across this amazing group of scholars and economists and development economists, and I don't know what I was doing before that, because it's such a rich environment, so I'm really happy to be here. So yeah, thank you, Alessio, for an invitation. Julio for, keep chasing me to reply emails. That's embarrassing. And also Michael for being a discussant. So yeah, what I decided. Oh, here. Okay, sorry. Good. Okay. So what I'd like to do today is the way I thought I could intervene in that debate, the question of planning, post-growth, what to do after capitalism, which is amazing, because then it seems to me then we're trying to think what's going to happen, hopefully after capitalism. And this is very much a work in progress. Well, everything is a work in progress. But the first time I started studying that is exactly a year ago, in a kind of a seminar where we were trying to think what socialism is, because nowadays everybody's socialist or kind of a social democrat socialist, and my idea was to go back to Barbara Wootton, who is a female, you mentioned sociologist, but she was first an economist and then she left that profession. So those trying to apply for economics, I tried to convince her to come back, but she was really disappointed with the profession in 1940s, and she left the profession and went to become a very famous sociologist. And there is this book from Barbara Wootton, two books actually. One of them is What About Planning? And the other one is The Lament of Economics, which is more a methodological book, a book about methodology where she's criticizing the way we do economics. You would think many of you doing economics in the sixth form, you're going to see some kind of a connection here. And when she's criticizing economics, she also started having engagement at the time with, I hope I pronounce his name right, Friedrich von Mises, yeah, and Hayek, which are, as we know, they're very well known for kind of putting market principles, on forward. And she's engaging with them to say, look, the criticism towards a planned economy towards socialism is actually misled. And when she started explaining that, I got very curious. So that's why I'm kind of going to use her to get into this debate. So that's the structure. I have an intro that's longish because I started working on that, as I said, a year ago, so I still find my way around it. And I'm really looking forward to the debate part of it because, to see where the gaps are. Then I'm going to get a little bit on the traditional economics theory, which I make, do my best to not get too boring, and then go back in a more exciting discussion, which then, what that all means for collective decision, and also for planning today. And I guess where I'm heading here, hopefully, is, and I'm really, curious to engage with all of you, if we actually need even rethink what we understand by planning, because I think today very much, when we talk about planning is the idea of a strong state allocating resources here and there, but very much within the market economy, very much within the market, the kind of price the price under the price mechanism kind of system. And the question I will be asking in the background of this presentation is a little bit about, can we really meet our wants, as economists like to say, like wants and needs and wants in that context. So that's what we will be doing here today. So I could stay in that slides for 10 minutes to talk about this amazing woman. she is totally invisible in economics. I came across her name by coincidence. She also was a Girton, the college I am in Cambridge, but in the 40s. She's contemporary of economists, a little bit more visible than her, with Joan Robinson. And she is known for being a socioeconomist, for trying to kind of making a case that economics should be a social sciences. And then, she went to become, as a lecturer at CETUA, a leading name in sociology and criminology. She's considered one of the most important. She made one of the most important contributions to 21st century British social policy. She also was the first woman to sit in the House of Lords, and which got really my attention is she was key in the creation of the welfare state in the UK. So we know about Keynes. I assume everybody has heard about Keynes at some moment, at some time in life. But she was behind this. It's a very interesting story. But basically, when William Beveridge report came up in '42, there was this economist, which probably we heard about him as well, Lionel Hobbins at LSE, said we can't trust Beveridge because he's not economist. And then Beveridge said, okay, fine, so I'm going to put a group of economists together to justify this creation of the welfare state. So Joan Robinson was part of this group. I don't know if you have heard of Nicholas Calder as well, Michael Kaletsky, most of their Cambridge economists, and Barbara Wootton. So I was quite surprised when I found out that she was behind that group. So she's quite important, and I think a little bit of this research is to put her on, make her visible again. I think that's quite important. So I'm not gonna spend more time on her. For the students that are very overworked, you can read her bio on Sunday morning. So I'm sure Sunday morning is when you're relaxing. You can read that book. I don't like bios in general, but this book is fascinating, really, especially for women who are trying to navigate this the waters of policy, economics, development. Is very empowering as well. So I highly recommend to read that book. So I think by now, those who are very curious to what's going to happen in the future, you're probably asking, okay, why again going back to the past? Why we're talking about socialism from the last century? Why Barbara Wootton keep reading these authors that are already dead? Why we don't think forward? Why we're not talk about post-growth? We want to know about post-growth and not really keep going back to these failed experiences from last century or the question of planning last century. I hope not all of you are thinking that way, but I come across that discussion very often within economics. Why keep going back to discussions from a different historical moment? And I think this is a very fair point, but I think we should be careful with two things. One is the obvious one. We need to learn with our mistakes. So I don't need to spend time on this. The literature on planning socialism is just vast from socialism last century. But there is also one question that we see a little bit in the socialist calculation debate, which is how we think about planning in the context of a production organization that has already been embedded in the market. Under that discussion, or this big umbrella of markets being a superior form of organizing production. If that was the case when Barbara Wootton was writing in the 1940s, now is even more the case, because that idea of markets being the best way to organize productions is really at the core. We are in a historical moment now where apparently at the end of the 80s, we had the end of history, but then now Fukuyama took that back. We are not I shouldn't mention him because he's very annoying at some point. But anyway, we went to the end of history, and then now we are back. We are before the history. But the reality is, I think the question for all of us here is, do we have the same alternatives on the table that we had in the last century? With all the discussion of what was socialism or not, planning, what we have seen in East European countries, in China and so on, in Cuba. So what is now? The discussion, to me, it seems when we read authors such as Fukuyama, it's not even anymore about the end of the history or not, but there is no alternative. It's the liberal principles, it's the question of improved markets and so on. So I think this exercise of going back to our past is more than learning from our mistakes. It's trying to grasp that debate of what was offered there as alternative in terms of organizing production, how some of these aspects have been consolidated in our everyday discussion of economics or policy, and how can we become creative, really, how we can think beyond that. And that is a little bit what I hope I will be doing here today. So is anyone familiar with Barbara Wootton, or anyone have heard of her? Have you?
Yes.
How?
I don't know, like you, random.
Random, yeah. It's a shame that we don't spend more time with her, but yeah, great. Glad there's one person who knows her. So in this, let's see where I am here. Yeah. So in this context of, what is happening then? So you're no longer, history is still there. By the way, for those perhaps that doesn't know this analogy for the end of history, are you familiar with that analogy? No? Yeah, a little bit. So this author that I mentioned before, Francis Fukuyama, is he what is he? He's a historian? No. Political. Oh, gosh, that's even worse than I thought. So basically, when the Berlin Wall fell, he wrote this book, which is called "The End of History and the Last Man," I think, where he's saying like basically liberalism won, capitalism won, and it's the end of history now. Everything is cool. That was a good summary. Who read the book? That was a really poor summary. Anyway, but. Then recently he wrote another book, kind of retracting a little bit the argument, because of course since then we had globalization, but then you also have crisis, inequality increasing, then you have the pandemic, and then now we have all this reckoning with the question of class, the racial inequality. So he retracts that kind of argument, but the argument that he put forward is that the liberal values haven't been really kind of didn't consolidate. That's why there is no end of history yet, that's why I was mocking that we shouldn't read him, but we should. I don't know what to say if we should or not. But anyway, so this is the reference. So my point with him, going back to him, is to say, look, that we still are where we are perhaps in the 1980s regarding this dispute between different ways to organizing production, to organize, basically how we produce commodities, how we distribute them, and so on. And but we are much less creative than in the 1980s after all this. And there are many reasons for that, and we can kind of discuss. So, reading Barbara Wootton, what I got from her, although she was writing in the 1940s, even like before the 80s, is that how when talking about planned economy in the last century, we have a kind of the question of production organization and that superiority of the markets. They were used to dismiss any discussion of planned economy, right? And Barbara Wootton, she was criticizing Mises and Hayek, talking to them and say, look, you can't criticize the planned economy from the perspective of the market, because it's not a market economy, right? And this seems like very minor, but actually, Mises was he wrote a letter to Barbara Wootton, she wrote a book on that, which is the planning. I forgot the title now. What about planning or something? And he actually said she was the only worth opponent he had, because she wasn't unpacking. Oh, should it be like this? No, the plan is that. She was saying, look, your starting point, by default, would say that planned economy is wrong, because you are actually looking at planned economy from the perspective of the market, from the perspective of how prices are measured within this market economy. And so I said, well, why Mises would say that she was this opponent? What is she worth an opponent? What she meant when she said, you're criticizing planned economy from a wrong perspective? Because I think, and that's what I want to develop a little bit here, the problem that she was raising at the time is still very much the problem we are facing now. regarding how to think of planning in a more, what I think could be in a more radical way, like she was thinking in the 40s. So how are you so far? Is he okay? Yeah? Okay, great. So I will take us back a little bit on the traditional economic theory, and what you can do here. I should have asked Alessia about my audience. We can always stop and clarify some concepts. Julio is here just for that. So any concept we don't know, he will clarify it for us. So Barbara Wootton was engaged in writing in a time where you have these great economists out there, Marshall, Wicksteed, Pigou, Hayek, and Keynes, and so on. And if you could summarize what she was saying, or the engagement she was having with them, she was saying, look, all of you are saying that economic theory is basically the study of the market process. But it's a very particular way to look into the market process. Like what you're saying is, you're looking at the market process through this interaction of demand and supply, which happens through prices. That's the market. That's how we interact in this kind of economic theory realm. And if that wasn't enough, when we are kind of elaborating this way to understand the economy, so is the market, is the supply side, is the demand side, the price kind of mediating that interaction. And she said, in the ideal situation here is that we reach an equilibrium where the supply equals demand. Yeah, the supply equals demand. And then that's one of the main criticisms of Keynes. That's the other way around in a very summary kind of a narrow way. So what she gets a little bit frustrated is economists, they are not creative anymore. Like everything they do, so they have, the starting point is always the equilibrium, is always the market, and everything they have to do is this kind of stock, part, and key to kind of unlock some kind of door to then address a problem. So we never know what's happening. We have this equilibrium as a starting point, and what economists they're doing, they're seeing the deviations from this equilibrium. Who here is familiar with economics a little bit? Or, yeah, does that make sense to you? Yeah? Yeah? Are you taking economics in A level? Oh, so you'll be like really sharp. Actually, they're the ones clarifying. Because economics in A level, you need another talk just to, unpack that. But anyway, so she's very frustrated. It's interesting because in her book she says, I started doing economics thinking about social betterment. And that's not going to happen that way. And she said, I can't have a framework to precisely kind of prove that economics should be for social betterment. But that's what it should be. And that's why eventually she left, because she realized it wasn't. So I'm describing an economic theory that's in the 1940s, but it's very clear that is very similar to what we are doing today, still teaching our students. So, similarities with today is, basically all this is still the same. If anything, all these points, they become, let's say, more formalized through mathematics. So a lot of people, they don't want, or students, they don't want to do economics because of the math. Or they get in and they get very frustrated because it's just math. So if anything, that formalization of the economy through the market became even more telling. So let's then get a little bit deeper on that. And again, just stop me if it's getting both boring and also difficult. So if you think of this traditional economic theory, what Barbara Wootton is trying to tell us is that what we have there is an economic norm. And those familiar with economics, they know that economists, they hate being called that they are doing something that's normative. They're super precise, they're objectives, like no, normative is like something in sociology or whatever, we don't do this, or it's a policy thing. But Barbara Wootton said, no, this is so normative. So she kind of started looking at this market process, and she said, look, first of all, you're contextualizing this market process, or you're trying to make that market process in the same way we look at some of natural sciences or even hard sciences, right? This objectivity that you can have experiment and kind of reach a conclusion. And because the economists, they want that, which then take us to another discussion, which is the physics envy that economists, will have, bring all the math from the physics to achieve that objectivity. And then she's saying at the time, 1940s, that's like there's no way that the economy can be a closed lab that you can actually have like precise correlations. Well, little she know about the RCTs, the randomized control trials nowadays that actually they try to control this, but that's again, sorry, different discussion. Keep going now, off a tangent. So yeah, so she's kind of like, so this is what's implied, otherwise you can't have that math, otherwise you can't think about supply and demand that way. And we need, like economists, they want that, they want to know what's happening to changes when we are going away from this equilibrium. And if you do, the way to do that, the way to understand how the market works, to be predictable, to have a set of uniformity in even laws that apply for every single market, regarding if it's in Brazil, in the UK, and so on, all this objective neutrality is kind of taking shape in that kind of way to understand the economy. And it's quite interesting because perhaps Mark and others would know, but she makes a reference of a poem, a kid's poem of the apple pie. I don't know, that's all imaginary or something. And but nowadays we have the kind of the same, we could have some similar discussion regarding how economics has been criticized for being detached from what's happening in reality. So another thing she said is clear, there is this assumption of human behavior, right? So they have what the human behavior should be, right? It's equilibrium, you should go and find the price to maximize your utility. The firms would come in and they're gonna find the price that maximize their profit. I'm sure you're very familiar with that. And then she's gonna say, so this is the point, right? Then she'll say, if you don't achieve that, then you keep trying to find a way to achieve that. So basically economists, they're looking at everything that's exceptional cases that depart from that norm, she's saying. That, so that's why the stock and key partnering thing. So you're saying we are just looking off the deviations, but the norm is established, is there, is the equilibrium. And that's why she's saying this is a normative way to do economics. And that really got my attention, especially because economists, they hate being, if they're accused that they're doing something remotely close to being normative. And then, if you think about that, if you think the market equilibrium is where the seller and the buyer, they confront each other, she said this point, this intersection when you have it to equilibrium, is where you have the satisfaction of these both individuals, right? Which are called in economics the representative agent, because they represent the society, right? So here's another debate regarding micro and macro, right? But you can't know what every single agent is doing, when economics is just kind of get you all together and one of you represent all the rational individuals. So that's another discussion as well that is implied there, right? So what happens here? Oh, sorry, that's the. So just to stop here a little bit. How is everything? Okay. Yeah. Good questions? No. We still have to do economics, by the way. That is, we still need to go there and change. So I hope I'm not gonna lose in a few. So what else I have to say here? Yeah, so it's interesting because one thing that Barbara Wootton is also saying is a science about human behavior, right? So the last thing we need is to trying to have one way to behave for all of them. And she used this term human volition, if I'm pronouncing right, which is like this realness that people have to do different things. So this would never allow for economists to have a coherent theory. So that's why we need that kind of rationalization of the individual and so on. So I think it's all I have to say here. These assumptions, of course, when individuals are trying to, that kind of economic framework, when they're trying to behave this way, she come up with the sentence, they are doing their best to make the means go as far as possible in the kind of fulfillment of what is said to be the use they need. Well, that's very Anyway, but yeah. So basically what she's saying is we keep going in circles, like because the norms are right there, the way you have to behave is right there. Okay, so I have this quote here. I know I was sharing that when I arrived, that I know some people don't like quotes in PowerPoint presentations, but that happens when we have the quote and we don't stop to read together. So what we're going to do, we're going to read that quote together, which I think is extremely important, and it has to do with this economic norm. So inevitably, the reader, unless differences are continuously and clearly stressed, will find himself implicitly ascribing to the market optimum, all the normative significance of the simple personal optimum of the Robinson Crusoe or the blackberry picker, and who will tend in consequence to slip into the belief that equilibration of demand, supply, and prices in price in the market produces maximum social satisfaction in the same sense as maximum personal satisfaction is produced by living off picking blackberries at the point at which you discover that you rather do something else. Is everybody with me? Right, so basically what this quote is saying, which there's lots to unpack, I agree, but what I like here is that we, in that kind of difficulty to bring the micro and macro together, and with this focus on the rational individual, on how we have the rational individual maximizing the utility and this firm maximizing the firms, we have this kind of equivalence between what is the personal satisfaction with what's the social satisfaction. And that's what I want from that quote. So, to kind of trying to summarize or get, let me see, here we go. To get, the quote is done. So let's go full on in this economic norm then. Let's try to wrap that up a little bit and move to, let me see, I have 20 minutes, that's great. And move to the next point. So what Barbara Wootton is arguing is that economists, they have this commitment. They're committed to approval of the principle in which they agree upon, which is the equilibrium, so which they agree upon some norm against which the economic merits of different actions must be assessed. So everything you do in a world is going to be assessed or judged against that kind of principle that they agreed. As Barbara Wootton said, there is no, they don't agree because it's the best principle. They agree because economics start pushing for this mathematization and formalization, getting a lot of this discussion from physics. But there wasn't a kind of, let's say, it wasn't a dispute between different explanatory theories, and then this one is the one that makes more sense, so let's rely on this. That wasn't the way that happened. And actually, if you're interested in that debate, there's a fantastic book by Philip Mirowski called More Heat Than Light, which is all about the marginalist revolution, when economists start to really become more mathematized and really focus on the market and how they're getting all these concepts from physics. Okay, so here we go. So the assessment, the judgment, looking to a form of... I heard something. Is a question? No? Okay, great. So, sorry. So their assessment, their judgment, looks into a form of behavior that is assumed to be rational, commendable, which indicates efforts direct to no other goal than the equilibrium, and is only applicable to economic theory. Oh, sorry, I got the time wrong. Okay, 12. Ooh. Okay, that is commendable. That's your fault.
Continue.
Okay, that's
economic theory.
Okay, great. Economic theory based on assumption of scarcity. So this is a normative judgment, even if economists may deny, and that's why I like Barbara Wootton very much in that point. And I know I'm going like around saying the same thing. As I said, this is still very much a work in progress. So if you heard me talking about this in a year's time, all this is going to be in one slide, hopefully. So now, this economic norm starts causing problems for collective decision making, which to me is what we are really after here when discussing planning. And why? Because if it is a condition in which we're looking at this equity marginal returns, and here for those not so familiar with economics, when we're talking about marginal returns, we're talking about when you have additional output in your production process and you get 1 unit increase on the other side, so you're trying to look at the return you get out of this addition. So when you have this is marginal principle we have when profit is maximized and when consumption, you take the most satisfaction of your consumption and so on. So, in that context is when we have this economics norm. But what should take in our attention is what's happening here is the alternative aims of a social group. If you think in terms of us as a social group, they are all converted in terms of a comparable terms, right? And how this is possible? Because we have this market mechanism getting all of our desires, needs, hope, aspirations, everything, and turn that in monetary terms, which is price. That's how we interact in this market. And that's why she called this an ingenious invention of pricing, because our interaction is just through price, and that's why the price kind of get all our needs, or represent our needs, and from her perspective and so on. So so to Barbara Wooten, she's saying, and I think it's very much our problem. She said, where is the collective? Where is the social here? How we're dealing with difference and so on. And of course, if we talk to economists right now, of behavioral economists, it's going to say, we have the heterogeneous modeling, we can get this, and that. But the principles or the axioms in economics is very much the same. So what she's saying for us, or what she wants to highlight, is we have a problem here, or a very important problem, which is when we are looking at the planned economy, we have this convention of what, and I like the word convention, because it's related to what I said before. There is no proof that's the best way to do economics. It was a convention that started happening actually in Cambridge in the beginning of the 19th century. And then she said this convention becomes part of the core argument against or criticizing the planned economy. So the criticism would be a planned economy is not guided by market movement of prices. And Barbara Wooten is, but why it should be? The market movement of prices isn't a market economy. How can we think a socialist economy in a different way? Why we are looking from that perspective to a socialist economy? So when she said that, she said a planned economy not guided by market movement of prices would have no criterion by which to gauge the economic qualities of its plan and its undertaking. Would be a gross violation of the economic norm. So basically what she's saying is that like Hayek and Mises, they are looking at the planned economy, a socialist economy, and saying, you guys, you don't have any way to understand norms of economic behavior, sorry, there's a typo there. But the reality is, what is this economic behavior? Is the economic behavior that economics, they define what it is in this core definition, with the core convention, which I've been trying to explain, going back and forth since the beginning. So this is a serious problem for collective decision making. Let's see if I missed something here. No, so what is the conclusion of Barbara Wooten, which I honestly think, and I know, as I said, I'm still working on this, but I think is still a key problem for us, is that this equi-marginal aspect of this economist norm excludes the definition of social satisfaction. That's not associated with maximum personal satisfaction produced by demand and supply equilibrium price in the market, and having this principle of the rational man, this principle of the self-interest and so on. And she's very clear that in that discussion there is no room for collective decision making. And to me, this is something we should start thinking now, because if you don't have ideas to think about planning or socialism or alternative to capitalism, if every time we open our mouth, people's going to say, hey, the famine in China, hey, Stalin killed everyone. So basically, I think for us is a moment to think about that, because we're going to have planning, we have a strong state, the big state, and we're going to fall again in the same trap we had actually in the last century, which is, with some hardcore lefties and Marx, they would say, we never had socialism. We had capitalism of state, where we're still producing under market principles and appropriate surplus, blah, 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 blah. So there is, I think there's a problem here, but I will finish on time so we can discuss.
10 minutes. Max.
He gave me 10 minutes. I'm almost there. So, economics basically is offering this foundation for criticize planned economy. So, I think for us, especially for that role, we need to look at any kind of planning from a different lenses. I'm saying this role because I think we are all oldies now, so we can't think outside of what has been said to us. I'm joking, but sometimes. So the point is, we have this, Uton said, if you don't think in a different way, the criticism, what economics providing us is a defense of this defense of the validity of the market mechanism and a justification for capitalism. And I know I'm going to be fast, but the way she reached that conclusion, this conclusion is amazing, because she's saying if that's your criticism, if you start from the price mechanism, basically we're just defending that market is superior anyway. So what's the point? And here is where, I don't know, no contradiction is supposed to be now. Here is where you have a contradiction that's very, very interesting, which is in that context, within this economics, you have economics that promote social policies to guarantee the operations in competitive markets. I mean, how much ink have we spent talking about market failures? Have we done market failures? It's just insane. I just wish you could have done the same, talking more about government failures, instead of say government is just useless. And then, but we do that while actually disencouraging economies from endorsing measures that involve any aspect regarding regulation, distribution, and so on. Which this is very much what's happening in the UK now after the budget, cut, or what is the intervention that the state should do or not, how much you should leave the capitalists, the firms, to find the best price mechanism through the market to do that. You cut taxes, and then they feel more encouraged to do that, and so on. So, I have another quote. Okay, that probably is also a good one, otherwise it wouldn't be there. So let's read again. So it's not argued that a planned economy would fail to provide a solution for any existing agnosticism as to the concrete interpretation of the economic norm. On the contrary, opposition to planning rests upon the belief that is definitely retrogressive, that it frankly substitutes the irrational for the rational, the darkness for the light. And here is more normative aspect, right? Everything that's planning socialism by default is a bad thing. So I think we are heading. That's I have 3 slides before that, but I can hurry up. So so under this economist norm, we have this rational distribution of resources. We have this optimal distribution of resources. This is also a problem because she says that it's a normative merit of the market. We're going to have the optimal distribution of resources, and that implies a equality of purchase power between consumers. And I don't need to say to you that that's not true, right? When we have parity of purchase power among consumers, and that is a problem. The implication of this take is also that there is no difference of income between purchases and so on. So is this market in individualism that kind of cause a problem for us as well to think in terms of a satisfactory distribution of resources? But this is just an extra point that comes from that framework, which perhaps I shouldn't have had here because it's an extra one. So where does this leave us? Planning today, and honestly, that's the last one. So in conclusion, I would say, if we deal with economic theory in a way is now, and those would say, that's just a modeling, this actually does influence policy a lot, and is what sometimes behind many decisions regarding what the government can and cannot do. So if you follow this, we don't have a space to define or even a discussion of what social satisfaction would be, other than associated with maximal personal satisfaction. This is a problem, especially under liberal values, which is, what, don't come to my private space, I will do this. So, the question of consumption, for example, if you want to tackle climate change, we're gonna have to do something about it, right? We're gonna have to have some intervention on how people consume things, especially the top 1%. So how are we gonna do that in that context if there will never be room for collective decision making? So you don't have the social satisfaction. So as you can see, I'm kind of going a little bit further than the traditional planning. I'm thinking about planning in terms of wants, satisfaction, social satisfaction, especially in the context of increasing inequality and climate change. And also, one thing that Barbara Wootton said, I find amazing, and I wish economics is discussing that now, is that if you don't see this individualism, if you look at the economy in a different way, you will probably be discussing the issue of satisfaction, of wants, of needs in a very different way, which for her is actually one of the most difficult problems facing human society. What is the social satisfaction? What I can consume that doesn't really destroy the world, but you're also happy and I'm happy. What I'm not going to consume in terms of thinking of society, because if I consume, I would be helping causing harms or so on. So I do not even discussing that because you're seeing individuals as atoms. So I think this is more questions for me. Again, begging all of you to contextualize the critiques to planning under this economic norm. How we think of planning under this framework. Do we need? I think this question, which is the question I would like. Sorry, no pressure. You guys should take is like, can we really, how we think about market price mechanism when we start thinking of planning? Should we just ditch that? How can we actually not think about price and market in that historic context to think about planning? Are those familiar with the socialist calculation debates? And I can come back to this. I think there is addition here to think of price as economic norm and not just like a mere technocrat device. And again, go back to that discussion of evaluating social satisfaction, which is a philosophical issue. I mean, I found out there's a huge literature on social satisfaction and so on, especially actually in the German philosophy, and I didn't know. So it is something very interesting, but it's something that is our responsibility as social scientists, and I do think economics is a social science. That is, thank you, sorry.
Thank you to Carolina for a really challenging presentation. Gave us lots to think about. Julio's just left, so that means we can't have any clarification on anything.
Yeah. Oh no!
Because you just pointed out he was the only one that was able to do so. So I'm sorry, all I can do is ask some more questions. You asked who knew Barbara Wootton and how I knew Barbara Wootton. To be honest, the only reason I knew Barbara Wootton is because she featured in a GMAT exam, which asked around a question which is the thing that I know her for, which is that she compared her salary as the Director of Education for London with the amount of earning that an elephant in Whipsnade Zoo achieved from giving rides to visitors to the zoo. That's the thing that I first encountered her on.
Oh, wow.
And it was quite an interesting comparison. Her point was that she was making a statement about how unequal financial reward is. That an elephant, by the way, the conclusion was the elephant earns exactly the same as she did, or earned at that stage in that year. So her comment was that there is no comparability between financial reward for one activity and for another. So that's the reason that I'd heard of Barbara Wootton. I also was aware that she was a very heterodox person herself. She was the founding member of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. She was the first female peer. She was also a member, the first chair of any gender of the Countryside Commission, and she was a founding member of the Pedestrians Association.
Oh, wow.
The last one being a precursor of what today is the argument about whether we should be promoting active transport, active mobility, cycling, walking, etc. So she was very much ahead of her time in thinking about some of the really big challenges that were confronting the society she was a part of. And by the way, her lifetime was 1897 to 1988. She lived a fairly long, well, reasonably long life, and took her through to not too much earlier than we are today. I'm sorry, I'm old enough that 1988 is not that long ago. So anyway, I didn't know about the apple pie. I'm sorry, I'll have to find out what she said about that. So she is a very interesting, she was also a founding member of the British Sociological Association, very varied. A very respected academic, but also a practitioner in lots of ways. So her challenge, and I think presumably the reason that von Mises thought that she was a worthy opponent, was that she was able to address his theories from a practical as well as an academic perspective. And I think in that sense she did add a lot to that debate. Now, of course, if we move on to what that debate was, I'm going to repeat a little bit in my own words what Carolina has just talked about, because I want to get to the point of what that means for us. So, of course, yes, for the classical economist, the heart of economics is precisely that idea of the demand-supply equation. Equilibrium is based on an assumption that markets will find some form of balance at a given price level on any particular service or good of any sort, and that overall that will lead to a situation in which you will achieve optimality. And if we take what that economics definition of optimality is, it tells us something important that I think relates to exactly that issue of individual satisfaction and social satisfaction. And I want to use the idea of course, fundamental to that is the idea that we're going to make some assumptions about how this model works. Those assumptions include things like perfect competition. Perfect competition is that there is an absolute free flow of information. Everyone knows the price, the quality and nature of all goods and services, and therefore, no one dominates the market on either side, the supply or the demand side. That if we make an assumption about all that raft of different things, the market is going to deliver us what we can call then Pareto optimality. What is Pareto optimality? It is that equilibrium. It is essentially, in terms of resource allocation, the fact that no one person could be made any better off without making someone else worse off. Now pause on that, because that definition of optimality tells us already that this is not an equation that has anything to do with social satisfaction. It only has to do with individual satisfaction on a limited level. Why do I say that? I say it because, think about it. If no one can be made better off without making someone worse off, then that means the poorest person can't be made $1 better off without making the richest person $1 less well off. In other words, it has no interest in equality. Nothing. None. It doesn't care how unequal society is. Now, if your system, market-driven system, classical economics-based market-driven system, has no interest in equality, then it has no interest in broader social satisfaction. So I think Witten's point there is really, really cogent. Market logic in that way, of course, relegates all the complexities of human behavior to a black box. It's a big, important black box. It's one that's defined by assumptions of rationality, expressed through preference. It's all designed to achieve that utility maximization that is supposed to be presumed to be the goal of the rational individual. Where rationality, preference, and utility are all assumed, but in no case defined, except in reference to themselves. So the assumption is that the behavior itself is rational because it happens, because everyone is rational, therefore what they do is rational. That the utility is maximized because it's rational for them to do so, but on the assumption that that rationality is self-defining. So of course, again, yes, that's the problem of that Barbara Witten talks about, which she talks about in terms of it doesn't account for human volition. It doesn't account for the complexity of why do we do the things we do? Can we literally say that every action is simply the most rational action in terms of achieving utility maximization? No, of course we can't. Now the difficulty is that yes, that succinctly analyzes a deficiency, but what do we do about it? And that, of course, is where we ended up and Carolina ended up with in her talk. Now, if we talk about, so the title of this this session referred to post-growth. We talk about deglobalization, de-development, degrowth. All of those things are processes. What does it mean? Degrowth means moving away from growth, not having growth. And yet, So they all describe a process of de-somethingizing ourselves, moving away from something, going somewhere else. But where are we going to? In practice, what's the change? Now, growth is still fundamental to our political discussion. Carolina said it influences policy in some ways. In fact, it's central on a daily basis. One of Rishi's 5 principles is exactly about returning us to growth. There's no apology for it. The opposition has said they are committed to ensuring a growing economy. Growth is still absolutely central. There is no political movement that is mainstream in this country, or in most countries, most, not all, but most, which is really challenging this idea that growth is what drives development. Now, if that's the case, then we have a really big problem. We've identified a paradox, a contradiction, a problem, and yet we're ignoring that problem and steaming ahead with something which is based on an idea that surely is impossible. We all know that perpetual motion is impossible. That's been proven. Why is perpetual economic expansion more possible? That would seem to be just as improbable, just as impractical as perpetual motion. Surely it relies on the continuous extraction of value from scarce resources. But what happens if growth stops? What happens if globalization stops? Okay, we've identified problems with them, but what happens with them given that our society is so fundamentally premised on their continuation? Understanding the deficiencies of each doesn't tell us what to do. Objecting to Hayek's criticism of planning, similarly, doesn't necessarily mean the answer is simply more planning. Planning also works more easily in the context of economic growth. What then does it mean to plan for a retreat from growth? And yet that planning is important. Now I would imagine that would be then what Carolina was talking about as radical planning. But what is that radical planning? If it's a radical planning based on more collective decision making, then perhaps we have some clues in some of the theorizing and the practical work on citizens' assemblies, referenda, participatory budgeting. But those things aren't easy to implement. And they do require a considerable amount of planning to ensure that they're able to be held at all. Fundamentally also, and I'm going to end on this point, this is just a response, not a lecture, they don't really address the existing inequalities that already are present within the system. Typically, those pressures, those initiatives will tend to consolidate the status quo to at least some degree, because people who have the resources will be the people that are most outspoken in speaking, in deciding, and making sure that they protect those resources. So it leaves us with some really fundamental questions still. As a response, as I said, I was trying to figure how I would conclude that response, and I'm afraid I knew fairly early on that what I was going to do was probably repeat some of the things that Carolina was saying, and ending with some of the same questions that she's asked. But I think those are the questions that we all have to confront. And working in a department that has the name development planning in its exact title means that it's fundamental to us, to our jobs, to try and think about what this means. But that is not an easy task. So I hope you're all going to join me, and certainly anyone that's studying at the moment, do economics. It's really important. But understand the shortcomings of economics, but also engage with this issue, this really important question of what does it mean to plan, given all the problems that we've just identified. So that's the end of my response. Thank you.
Why not? You guys stay there. I'll get the microphone. No, you sit. I'll bring the mic. So we're now inviting, because we like planning. We have 21 minutes before 7. Let's.
But I noticed that the schedule finishes at 6:59. So actually, we've only 20 minutes.
But the idea now is that we're gonna take maybe 2 or 3 questions or interventions from the audience and also online. Okay, 1 and 2. Let's start. Okay, let's start with you.
My question is this dichotomy between planning, like a planned economy, and a non-planned economy, somewhat of a false one, given that arguably the way that most capitalist economies work today, they are incredibly centrally planned. So you have private equity, asset managers who are planners of the economy, and in some ways arguably more so than the Chinese economy, where you have the 100 flowers bloom, etc. So I guess is part of the challenge sort of moving beyond this false dichotomy of planned versus non-planned and moving towards the question of what kind of planning do we want and towards what ends?
Thank you. Please.
Oh, sure. I guess I'm more of a scientist than an economist, so the idea of evidence and implementations is always interesting, and the point was raised in the response about there are some places that perhaps approach these ideas in the current moment closer. What do those places look like? I don't know if that's China or Norway, and is there anything we can draw from that currently exists to say this is what it might look like?
Shall we start with these 2 points? And please, both of you, Michael and Carolina. Carolina first, Michael, or vice versa.
Go away.
You go first.
No, I go first. Okay.
Sure.
Plan and no-plan economy, a false dichotomy. This is a very interesting question. There is the discussion within hardcore socialists and also Marx when explaining the organization of a corporation is this is pure planning. And also when we were talking about this kind of development of capitalism towards the shareholders kind of discussion, which is something that some people, scholars, they argue that what Marx is saying is he's saying this is social capital, it's completely planned, and then that's how we're going to go to a different society, which has never happened. So I agree with that in terms that we see within capitalism, planning and organization is there, even if it's anarchical in a way, in terms of kind of a big brother kind of coordinating all of us. Well, there's always some conspiracy theories. So I think, to me, what I'm kind of trying to get us to, and perhaps you're right, I should frame that in a different way, is that the planning to me is much more linked with this collective, the collective decision making, which take us to what Michael was saying, is that People's Assembly, what it is, and we're still gonna face the difficulty to make their work within this historical moment if the state and other big corporations being so strong. So I don't have the kind of the final answer, but I definitely agree with you that perhaps we should push forward the argument that the type of planning we want is a planning where resilience and well-being is at the core, where we find a way to create democratic forms of having, being able to kind of conciliate this collective decision making. And I know this is very utopic, and that's going to take me to the next discussion. And I don't have an economic example, but I think the question of abortion in Ireland is an interesting one, because it was decided through People's Assembly, and Ireland, it's like Brazil. The Catholicism is something insane, and they managed to do that. We still haven't managed that in Brazil, have we? No. Yeah. So I think, there is this. I don't know. I think this is a good example. It's not an economics example. It's much easier in a way, but it's still dealing with status quo, dealing with tradition, with something that's conventional, and trying to move forward. But you have a point, and I will be more aware of the type of planning we want. Regarding evidence, should I go to the second one as well?
Sure.
Yeah. Regarding
you might answer my bit, and then I don't need to.
That's not good. Regarding the evidence, I think China is, in terms of price, I must say, now it's recorded, God knows what that's going to end up on, but the controlling of price in China is amazing. And I recommend all of you to read a book of a dear friend of mine, Isabella Weber, on China. And, most of there's all discussion how China managed from 1979 to become what it is now. China in the 70s, they had this delegation visiting Brazil. The GDP in Brazil was 10 times more than China, and then they have how we can copy you guys, and then look what happened. And the controlling of price of key, especially raw material, primary commodities, it was really important. Now, we still, this is a evidence. Sorry?
And the banking system.
In the banking system. Now, is the evidence? I don't know, because then there's the other side, right? We can't really say that there is no inequality in China. There is all this question of inequality increasing in China. I'm not that familiar with the Norway case, but the only thing I will add is that I always find complicated to look at Scandinavian countries, the question of oil. You know, they are always outliner, because the way they can provide the population through the, how do you call the sovereign wealth fund, I think it's really hard to compare. So I don't, maybe you have an example that's more positive than me, but I can't see, apart from like an economic sphere, the controlling of the prices, I can't see other than China doing, yeah.
I think, actually I would say I think that planning and not planning is a false dichotomy, in the sense, and I was trying to sort of point to that, I guess, when I said that rejecting Hayek's kind of criticism of planned economies doesn't mean just more planned economies. So the negative of the negative is not a positive. I think it needs something different, and the reason is because I think planning in that sense still rests on economic growth. And in that sense, that relates to Carolina's point before, that the true Marxist will say Marxism has never been tried, because the Soviet Union was trying to plan an economy that was still based on growing that economy, even if the distribution was controlled centrally. So I would say no, it's not about planning or not planning, it's about growth. And if you take away growth, then both planned and non-planned, or Hayekian non-planned, because as you also say, actually the unplanned economy is very planned. It's just a different kind of planning. I mean, there's a lot of literature on that, and it's quite interesting. But yeah, of course, the market doesn't operate in the way that it operates without a whole raft of legislation, judicial systems, and so on to enforce contracts, to enforce property rights, and so on. So it's just different. It's not the same kind of planning as a central planning department that decides where you put resources for whatever, infrastructure, etc. So in that sense, yes, I would say it's a false dichotomy, but it leaves us with the question of what does radical planning, if radical planning is not just planning that's not Hayekian, what does it mean? And I do think actually citizens' assemblies, participating budgeting and so on, are probably about the most sophisticated tools we have as planners to think about how we might do planning in a different way. I don't think they've fully addressed the problems, but I think they do change the equation in a way that's important, and we should be looking very carefully at how we use them. In terms of examples of other countries that have tried to do some of this stuff, I think I'm not going to talk about China. I think China is just as dependent on growth as anywhere else, even if the planning system is different. Where there has been an attempt to try and do something different, not necessarily successfully, but with some interesting results, countries like Ecuador and Bolivia, which have incorporated the Quechua idea of sumak kose into their constitutions. That is not an unparalleled success, but it is an attempt to try and build into the understanding of society of those countries an understanding of well-being that is not based simply on economic growth or enabled by economic growth. Bhutan also has tried very hard to adapt a different model for development, which is based partly on selling very expensive tourist packages to people that can afford it. But, with actually, I think, a very genuine commitment to making that tourism more sustainable. It's bloody expensive, so not everyone can afford it. So yeah, there's definitely an elitist angle to it. But as an economic model, it is a bit different from the free market, open access, come if you can afford to stay at whatever hotel you want, and if you want to be a backpacker, no problem. So there is an attempt, and Bhutan is not just about tourism. They've tried to do that on a much more holistic basis within the economy. Again, there's criticism that that's a very controlling environment, and it is, and it's a form of planning, but it's not a planning that's premised as exclusively on economic growth as all the other systems that really we see around us.
Can I ask you about Singapore?
Sure.
Because it is also very, the state's quite strong there. Would it fit as an example or not?
It's still based on the idea of economic growth. I mean, fundamental is for Singapore is financial services, trade, and that's been the way that Singapore has managed to move itself into a position which is high wealth, but it's high wealth in a very traditional kind of idea of expansion of the economy, of a very small economy, but in a way that's managed to capture, extract premium rent from the activities they're engaged in. And because Singapore doesn't have much in the way of natural resources, it means overwhelmingly they've relied on financial services, trade, where they can achieve a value added, so that economic rent is not the rent on the fact it's a production of land and natural resources. It is on labour, but overwhelmingly it's on financial capital. That would be my answer. And Norway too. How does Norway achieve what it achieves? It achieves it by, as we said, oil, extractive industries. It's about maximising the profit that you get from those to be able to reinvest that in other bits of the country. Now, they've done it very cleverly, but it's still not a radical deviation from the traditional model.
And also impossible to reproduce, right? Because
unless you have oil, tough.
Yeah.
And if you do have oil, maybe also tough if you haven't got the social structure that Norway has.
as well.
Yeah.
Have 1 and 2, yes.
A couple of points. One, in specific reference to Norway. The UK had the same oil reserves as Norway, and we're not in the same position at all. Isn't that a pretty strong advert for planning, as opposed to?
Oh yeah, I mean I agree. I just don't think that takes us away from the economic growth model.
No, fine. It started with that something.
You can plan better with that economic growth model or worse.
Yeah.
And Norway's definitely done better.
And I don't come from an economics background, but it does feel to me like do you think there's a bit of humility lacking in the field, particularly with all those names that you mentioned?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah,
No, I don't. So Hayek and Keynes I'm familiar with, but the others I didn't know. But lots of, presumably males, stating with great certainty that this is a science, completely overlooking social well-being, just because it's difficult to measure. How does that have any credibility at all still?
Yeah, I mean, this is. Sorry, what's your name?
My name's Guy.
Sorry?
Guy.
I started studying economics, doing like Brazil development, and this question just, I couldn't let it go, and eventually now I just study economics as a discipline, which it wasn't my initial answer, and why we can't move on, why you can't actually have economics, a discipline that focuses on well-being. And there are so many, there the sociological discussion that has to do with how scholarship and policy is produced, the relation between academia and politics, and that gatekeeping regarding who get the funding, who publishing this and that. There is the question of the politics itself, linked to a kind of a science that promotes like market and capitalism and so on. So to challenge that is to take the privileged away from this top 1% to top 0.01%. So that would be the political argument. There is the question, which is more methodological, which I feel very sorry for my students, that we have to have abstract modeling, methodology. If you say to economists, let's study methodology, because all this is the theory and the implication of it. Like non-economists would study what marginalism actually is, right? You just study the applied concept of marginalism, admitting that's how assuming that that's how the word works. So I think there's a job to be done to teach students of economics at the undergrad and graduate level that there is a dispute between theories, that the economics, because right now the economics they learn is given as is taken as the best economics. Is ridiculous. It's an evolutionary thing. We have all this battle of ideas, seasonal classical economics, and boom, this is the best one. So I think, to me right now, and I'm relatively new doing this, I think there's a question of you have just to give ammunition to our students, so you can approach equality from different perspectives. You can understand classes from different perspectives. For example, one thing that disappeared here, we don't talk about social classes. You do economics at any level, there is no social class. Why? Because everything's a methodological individualism. But we don't talk about that for the students. So, go to the students and say, look, our principle here is no classes. We are using that principle. And I honestly believe that the students, they're going to become much more powerful because they can make choices, right? I have students that went to work on the government economic service. So Cambridge sent students to the city and government economic service. And is that being recorded? Okay, they are working there doing the Brexit and trying to model in something of impact on fishing industry. And of course the impact wasn't great. So they had to tweak to kind of ameliorate things and so on. And this student, he wasn't creative enough to challenge that because we trained them in such a narrow way that they couldn't challenge. So to me now it's how we empower students of economics. I don't know. I think this department, Mariana's, the department I am, they're trying to push for economics that's more well-being centered, but then they're taking as not being economists. I actually, people wouldn't say I'm an economist because I push for that. So I think we need more communication with society. So sorry, that was a long answer that doesn't really is an answer, but we're sorry for that.
Shall we take 2-3 max more
Can
points?
I just add one very quick thing?
Sure.
There is a growing amount of literature. I check out Real World Economics, which used to be called Post-Autistic Economics, which is probably the best title, which is why they changed it. But heterodox economics, which is challenging exactly that kind of mainstream economic understanding that's taught in schools. If you haven't engaged with that literature, I would really encourage you to do so, because it is exactly, and this is where Carolina is working. I mean, that's what a lot of the initiatives you're involved with are dealing with. So there is an increasing amount of literature out there, which I hope has been taught in schools. I don't teach in schools, so I don't know. You guys can tell me, but I hope it is. Yeah.
Okay, fine. So we have 1, 2 at the very back, and 3. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I haven't come across degrowth and post-growth thinking and policies applied to planned thinking as well. So it's really interesting to kind of see both. Coming from a background of actually growing up in a planned economy in Eastern Europe, I definitely see that it's really, you can still have an economy that is not necessarily obsessed with prices and kind of following the market movement of prices, and you can still be an economy obsessed with growth. So I think it's important to also kind of make all of those distinctions and create kind of the case studies around it. I also think that a planned economy does not equal collective decision making, obviously, so it's important to also kind of distinguish that. I also, on the examples, there was also another question that I was going to raise. I think, the examples that were given are isolated, and I think we need scale. Obviously, a lot of the ideas need to be scaled up and need to be kind of coordinated. Otherwise, you're risking having an isolated economy if we're still going to focus on the economic kind of theory and economic model that we currently have. And then finally, as a recovering economist and having studied at GPU 10 years ago, I've been drawn to the behavioral side of economics a lot more, and obviously development economics, but from a behavioral perspective, and that helps to answer some of those kind of, really, really hard questions to answer around individual versus kind of collective decision making or the social satisfaction. And the example I always give in terms of kind of where economics can be good, in terms of at least kind of considering the behavioral side and where they have failed, and that's why you have behavioral economics to kind of help address some of those failures, is this quote of people respond to incentives and kind of how we can incorporate some of those kind of incentives to create the social satisfaction, to create kind of more redistributive and better economies or better kind of well-being. And I would love to kind of maybe hear examples or kind of how you see some of those kind of newer developments in economic theory being applied in a better way.
Blue shirt and green shirt.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I thought it was really interesting as well. So the UK does have regulated markets, right? Like electricity and water is capped. There are price caps on those. Limitation on that has more to do with the kind of flow of capital. So the capital is handed over to the.
Yeah, price caps.
it has to do with how the kind of that capital, even though those prices are regulated and planned, that kind of capital is owned by the private sector, and that kind of accumulation, unfair distribution, accumulation of capital. How does the planning framework that you guys talk about apply to how, I mean, going not to try to jump into like the redistribution of capital, but I think if we're just thinking about planned economy in terms of pricing and ignoring how this capital has been accumulated, how do you apply that planning framework to kind of create a society where like the capital itself that's being extracted? You talk about Norway, that's an extractive industry. How do we use this capital and apply this framework of planning to capital ownership and not unfair distribution?
Thank you.
My question is quite a simple one. It's just about how we can measure progress if we're not using growth, because growth is quite a simple metric that we can quite easily explain to other people. So what metrics would you suggest, and how can we get everyone to agree that these metrics are useful and best for everyone?
Thank you. Yeah?
Should you want to go first now?
Yeah, well, have we got, is this the last round? It is.
This, I think this is the last round, unless you're like really, really burning for like a question that hasn't been asked.
Well, if I go first, then you have the last word. So.
Yeah, is okay? Yeah.
That's cool.
Okay, so I'll be brief. I'm glad you mentioned, who mentioned? You mentioned scale? I can't remember. Someone said scale. I think scale is a big thing, and I'm gonna be a bit dystopian here and say I'm not sure that planning is going to be about getting everyone to agree. I think that increasingly what we're going to be dealing with is fragmented polities, in which some of which planning is more functional, and some of which it's less so, and that those polities may or may not coincide with countries. And that we're going to see, that's the fragmentation we're going to see as we move forward, where on a smaller scale, it's possible to plan in a way that is not possible on a bigger scale. And I think that's going to become a really important part of this discussion about what we mean by planning in a post-growth context. Because I think everyone is going to be confronting very difficult dilemmas, some with more resources at their disposal, possibly from having made lots out of, extractive industries or whatever, and others with much less in resources. And the way they respond will shape the direction they go in the future. So in that sense, I think it's dystopian in the sense that I think some of those planning units, if you want to call them that, will be much less successful than others. And so you won't see a diminishment of inequality. You'll probably see an increase, but within a location, you might see greater equality. Now, if we think of it in those terms, we're thinking along the lines of what does scale mean? So, what are we talking about? Planning, radical planning, at what scale? And then I think the conversation changes, and we can start having more meaningful conversations about using tools like participatory budgeting or citizens' assemblies or whatever. But that scale shift is fundamental. But without that, where do we start? Because we can't get everyone's agreement, because no one's going to accept the sacrifice, or not no one. But many people are not going to accept the sacrifices that they need to move to a more collective decision-making process. I think that's all I want to say, actually, because I think somehow it touches on all of the comments, the questions that were made. And anyway, I think Carolina should have the last word.
Thank you for that. So, the question, to go back to you. So you're a behavioral economist? No, you became one. No. Not at all. I'm an urbanist. Oh, okay. First thing is, it's the second time I have this opportunity to discuss that topic. As I said, 1 year ago I started working on it, then life happened, and then with this invitation I went back. And when I finished preparing for this talk, I realized that I should probably at the beginning be very clear of what I mean by planning, or going like planning is that. And as I said, this is a work in progress. I think where I'm heading to And like the radical plan is something that popped up in my mind yesterday. I haven't read any literature on radical planning, but I wanted to make I knew something wasn't right because planning is already a category, so much baggage in at the practical theoretical level. But I definitely think I'm kind of putting planning as synonymous of collective decision making at that theoretical level, following a little bit what Barbara Otten is saying. But this is all this is very new. I haven't written any paper on this. I'm not sure, but I definitely need to. You're definitely right. I need to highlight this because I don't think planning can be collective decision making, obviously, right? But I want to try to understand that more, and that is definitely a work in progress. I also think we should be very careful with writing on the answer. I can see you're shaking your head. Planning is not that. But if you're in the social science, you know that nothing is set in stone. So that shouldn't be a behavior you should have, right? Because concepts and theories, they can change. And as scholars and researchers and people educating, you should be aware that concepts, they change. So the question of scaling up, I agree with that. I think one of the big challenges with the grand challenges we're facing right now is definitely how we move beyond the national borders, right? How we can have a coordination and thinking about climate change. The divide between global south and global north when it comes to climate transition is something that is obvious, that the global south is going to become the exporter of lithium, especially Latin America, for SUVs in the US, because they need 10 SUV each family. I don't know what they need so many SUVs. And what's going to happen, because it's extracted from, so the largest reserves in like Argentina, is it Argentina, Chile, and Colombia? The triangle, I forgot the name now. But anyway, it's the largest reserves, but it's just extraction. So it extracts lithium from there, and then it goes to Asia. So the aggregate value of producing the batteries is in Asia, and then it goes to basically European markets. So what's going to happen to these countries in the global south? There is a lot of conflict because most of this lithium is in indigenous land, as we know. The question, I don't know how many of you are from Chile or follow the Chilean referendum, but one of the main points there was to protect some of the land that is that has the lithium. And of course, the Canadian mining companies like, no, this referendum is not good. Obviously, it's not good. So what? So how we do this? Like Chile shouldn't be having this fight on its own. It's not a fight at the national border. So I don't know. I mean, even when it comes to the concept of the theorization of what economy is. I mean, Keynes is a fantastic economist, a progressive economist, and most of his theories at national level. All these institutions, the Keynes institution, the Bretton Woods institution that come, the IMF, the World Bank, even the UN, they're all they are multilateral organizations, but still under the nation-state kind of framework. I don't think they're actually ideal for us to deal with some of the challenges. Do we need to reform them? Do we need a new one? I don't know, but you're definitely having a problem. Behavioral economics. So I have two levels of this answer. Sorry, I'm going on, but this is important. The first one is the teaching and research level. So I welcome behavioral economics, and but I also think the bar is so low, because obviously any social science look at us like, why are you saying the individuals are rational? You talk to a sociologist, anyone, why are you doing this? So in a way, what behavioral economists did, which comes from psychology, is just say, we are not rational, and you're not the same. So it's like the bar is so low that you don't need much. And most of the Nobel Prize winners putting behavioral economics forward, and I'm sure every time I interview any students get at Cambridge, they read Daniel Kahneman. What's the name of his book? Fast Thinking, Fast and Slow. They all read that. To me, there is no challenge of any of this framework I discussed. So it's the same thing with inequality and Piketty. Who's heard of Piketty? And everybody now doing inequality. Zuckman was here last week, right? The question is empirical work. We know inequality is increasing, fine. How that had a feedback loop into theory that we are teaching our students? Behavioral economics, non-department in economics in the UK teach behavioral economics as core module. None. So at the teaching and research level, there are 2 points. Are we teaching students behavioral economics? No. Is behavioral economics that radical? I would kind of look with some care. The nudge aspect, sorry, I criticize everything. I also have a concern. UK has the nudge unity, which is fantastic, right? So one thing that probably you came across is the sugar issue, right? Kids in UK just stuff themselves with sugars. And here comes the nudge unity, full of behavioral economists. We have an idea. Design the supermarket in a way that the sweets are not in the front, right? The thing is, family in the UK can't afford fruits, right? They can't afford eat well. Sweets are very often cheap. So you don't, my concern if any nudge unity, because now it's fashionable in any government, is will not address the structural problem. You can hide the sweets. Doesn't mean the family is going to have money to buy healthy food. So I don't know, but then I can go on and on this. So the regulated market, I will do this 2 minutes. Regulated market, I don't think I got your question. But one exercise I do for my students is choose a policy in the UK and trying to work it out if this policy is within the market failure approach, right? Or is within what we teach at IPP, or is the market shaping approach. So I'm not that familiar, but most of my English students doing policy in the UK, they can actually make the link that most of the regulated market in the UK, they are conceptualized under how we fix that market failure. It's not even the kind of planning we were discussing. It's still very much like we need to intervene in that market to control this or that at that moment because there's a market failure, asymmetric information, or something happening. So I really need to look properly at what you're saying to be able to reply to that. In a positive end, measures of progress. So yeah, GDP, I think everyone is very familiar that GDP doesn't really assess the well-being, or there is even now more and more studies making the correlation between higher GDP and levels of happiness. It never matches. It's always opposite. So GDP is something that we created in the 60s, right? Again, not set in stone. I don't understand. Goes back to some of the question why you don't move beyond GDP. I have actually students that want to do a PhD on this, and I really want her to do it as well. And so, but we have alternative measures, especially for the climate change. We have green GDP, we have a happiness index, but all of these, now I'm going to start copying Michael, all of these actually is within the growth framework. So I don't know, I'm not an expert on this, and there are economists doing, heterodox economists doing fantastic work criticizing GDP and showing how we measure progress in a way that's more inclusive, but also that assess any more things that does the monetary value. So there are indexes there. There are some interesting measures, and then perhaps we could focus, okay, let's change, no more GDP, let's do the green GDP. But then we're going to get together here. Is a step forward, but perhaps Mike will come to us and say, you're still in economic growth paradigm. So I don't know. So I think yeah, the challenge is more challenging than we think it is. That's not a positive note. But
Yeah, you promised to be positive.
Yeah.
I was keen to see what that was going to be.
Yeah, but I don't know. You finish on a positive note.
Thank you all for coming. Is that positive?
And come to study UCL. But thank you very much. This event has been recorded. You can rewatch online, share it with your friends, and we have many of these events also because this year is DPU's 70th anniversary. With more of this discussion. But thank you very much for coming. Thank you.